Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. I'm Tom Lanning. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. Welcome to Ream Library. The McFarland Center sponsors a variety of lectures, conferences, special events on campus that explore questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. If you want to see some of our past talks, or this one even in a couple of days, you can see them online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center, so students can tell your friends that they can catch the lecture later. I've been looking forward to this talk for a long time, even more having met the speaker and spent some time with him today. It's great to have the opportunity to engage a speaker whose written insights I often gravitate to in the New York Times, and to have him speak on a subject that really fascinates me. It's a theme that's raised by the marvelous current exhibit in the Cantor Art Gallery, Dharma and Punya, Buddhist Ritual Art of Nepal, co-curated by Professor Todd Lewis, Distinguished Professor of Arts and Humanities here at the College of the Holy Cross, and Jenna Kim, Professor of Art History and Architecture at Harvard University. The exhibit features spectacular ritual works from Nepal, evoking the religious world that they come from. But there are always questions about what happens when you take a religious work out of its religious context and turn it into a museum object. There are questions about how you look at religious objects when you're trained to think of them in a way that's objective, or at least secular, as an art historian might. Holland Cotter is an outstanding person to help us navigate some of these questions. Before I do introduce him, I want to point out that this is a lecture sponsored by the Deichmann Family Lectures. The Deichmann family, it's one of the Deichmann Family Lectures on Religion and Modernity, and we're grateful to John Deichmann of the class of 1970 and his family for their support. And I do want to encourage you, if you haven't seen it yet, to spend time looking at the Dharma and Punya exhibit before it closes on December 14th. After you've heard this lecture, you'll have new eyes and new perspective to look at that, and I know you'll enjoy it even more. Holland Cotter is co-chief art critic for the New York Times, where he's been on the staff for more than 20 years. In 2009, he won the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism for his, quote, wide-ranging reviews of art from Manhattan to China, marked by acute observation, luminous writing, and dramatic storytelling. While most often focused on the art in New York City, Holland is recognized for bringing contemporary Asian art, specifically from China and India, to the attention of Western audiences. He spent a month in China in the lead up to the 2008 Summer Olympics, and in 2012 he made an extended trip to Africa, writing on Ethiopia, Mali, Ivory Coast, and Senegal. He holds degrees from Harvard, where he studied poetry with Richard Lowell, the City University of New York, where he studied American modernism, and Columbia University, where he studied Sanskrit and taught Indian and Islamic art. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has served on the board of directors of the International Association of Art Critics. So, I'm excited to hear from him today, and I look forward to please join me in welcoming Holland Cotter.
I want to thank Tom and Todd Lewis, the curator, the co-curator of the exhibition, which is fantastic. And he gave me a tour this afternoon, which is really enlightening. And I encourage everybody to go see it. You know, the time was we would get a show like this in New York City. Asia Society used to do shows like this frequently. They don't do these shows anymore. And it's a size show that the Met really doesn't do. So we're not getting this information in New York that you're getting here. And it's wonderful to see it. Yeah. The second, I want to apologize that I don't have any pictures to show you. My laptop had a sinking spell last night, and the help desk guys weren't on the help desk, so I don't have it with me. So you're just going to get words. And the words you will get, I've got to say, are the furthest thing from being a scholarly paper. This is not what this is I have today. It's really a personal account of how I got interested in art, which is basically the story of my education and how that education developed in certain directions, which led me to view art, or certain kinds of art, as an interactive, energy-generating phenomenon. I'll attach the word spiritual to this phenomenon, a term not popular or even permitted really in the larger precincts of the art world in which I usually move, but it's a term that I consider to be reality-based. I grew up not all that far from here in a suburb of Boston. My interest in words and in writing started when I was very, very young. The groundwork was in literature. When I was 5 or 6, my mother used to read us poetry at the dinner table on the nights that my father, who was a medical doctor, was on call at the hospital. So it was me, my sister, and my mother was reading to us. And she didn't read us the easy Emily Dickinson poems, the nice Emily Dickinson poems that usually find their way into the anthologies. She read us the tough ones, the extreme ones. And Dickinson is a writer of piercing visual images. She once said that she knew real poetry when she encountered it because it made her feel like her head was exploding. That's what her images made me feel. She's one of the great religious and spiritual poets of her century, although she would have bristled at being so described because she had real problems with religion. Anyway, I also felt very, very moved, even as a little kid, with the words and images and ideas that she was writing. I learned at that point that images could, in fact, ambush you, go off like depth charges. In my experience, their impact was as much neurological as mental, and I transferred this reaction to the art that I would later be looking at. I had very much the same feelings about images that I encountered. By this time, I had also started learning about art. I come from a museum-going family. Our main museum was the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the MFA. And art museums in the late 1950s were not at all like museums today. This is before blockbusters, before museums became basically entertainment centers and social centers. The MFA, on an average day, I remember being empty, gray, totally quiet, like a library. I dimly remember there was no admission charge at that time. So it really was like a library, which I think museums should be. All of them. They should be free to everybody. On Saturdays in the winter, beginning when I was around 9 years old, maybe 10, my parents would drop me off at the museum in the morning and leave me there and go about their family business, their city business. I was in the protective custody of the security guards, who all knew me after a while, and I knew them. And because I was a bookish, pretty self-directed kid, they let me go where I wanted, and I went everywhere in that museum. I got to know pretty much the whole collection very early, very well. Egyptian mummies, John Singleton Copley portraits, Netherlandish altarpieces, Monet landscapes, and the bronze figures of Hindu deities in the South Asian collection that had been assembled at the turn of the century by Ananda Coomaraswamy. And I especially loved the Japanese galleries because they had a walk-in version of a temple hall lined with big carved Buddhas sitting in a circle, and you could join the circle just by sitting on a bench in the hall. Believe me, if you're hearing Emily Dickinson when you're 6 years old and you get her, and you're hanging out with Buddhists when you're 10, there's no way you're going to be a normal person. Anyway, that was the primal scene. I see now how valuable those self-curated museum tours were. No one was saying to me, look at this, but ignore that. This is great, that isn't. Or no one was saying, this is art and that's not art. So I looked at everything. Right from the start, I got a sense of the side-by-side existence of all kinds of art from many different cultures. And just as important, I got a sense of the equal value of those cultures. I think because of that immersion, no art has ever felt foreign to me, in the sense of being unapproachable, which doesn't mean that a lot of it hasn't felt mysterious and surprising. And this is still true. By the time my parents were dropping me off at the museum on Saturdays, I had already had another kind of art education. That one was in a Roman Catholic elementary school. My parents weren't practicing Catholics. My mother had been raised in Mary Baker Eddy's Church of Christ Science. and then had married a doctor, which was considered a really bad idea. They wanted me to go to school, go to a school where I could learn languages and have exposure to art and music. So they enrolled me at a local school run by a French-speaking order of nuns. The bilingual education they hoped for didn't work out. Although the nuns, who were Canadian, spoke French among themselves, the classes were in English. But the art education was fantastic. Unusually, I think, for an elementary school, the emphasis wasn't on making art, but on learning art history. The nuns were really into it and introduced us to pretty much the whole span of Western art. This is, little kids. The whole span of Western art, ancient, modern, religious and secular. We were given sets of postcard-sized prints, which I loved, and which I pored over. For a while, my favorite image was Matisse's Blue Window, which is now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. It was then, too. Its oddity of form and space totally fascinated me. It's an image of the interior of a room, but one so abstract that I remember feeling that the room was still, that it was an unfinished painting, that the room was still in formation, and that let me complete it and make it my own space. And to this day, I love this particular image. And there was another important dimension to this art learning. The school, which was built in the 1950s, had a small chapel inside the main building. And when the other kids were out in the playground, I used to like to sit there by myself. I wasn't into sports at all. I'm still not into sports. The chapel was filled with images, most of them statues of saints, all wood-carved in a kind of sleek Danish modern style, all carrying symbols that identified them as particular people with distinctive personalities and histories. Also, I noticed that periodically, small offerings would have been left as gifts in front of the statues. A vase of flowers or a candle or maybe a holy card. Occasionally, I'd find someone kneeling in front of a statue praying. So I understood these objects as being in some sense alive. Exchanges of energy between them and the world was taking place. Between them and me was taking place. Images, in some real sense, were animate and proactive. They didn't just stand there, they did things. You looked at them, and they looked at you. Without really knowing it, I ended up bringing this sense of interactivity with me to the museum, the MFA. I started college in 1966. I was an English literature major. But more or less by accident, the first course I took was an art course. All freshmen in the school were required to take a science course, one science course in their entire 4 years. So I was terrible at science. I was terrible at math. I was terrible at science. I was terrible at everything that I didn't like, basically. So I scoured the course listings for a doable option, and I found just one, an anthropology course called Primitive Art. And you have to remember that this was in 1966. At that time, there had only been one PhD granted, art history PhD granted in African studies in the United States, and that was in 1957. That was Roy Sieber, I think, at University of Iowa. The next one to be granted was 1957. The next one was in 1966, which is the year I was taking this course, and that was Robert Ferris Thompson at Yale. So it was a field that had very little privilege, let's say, in the art history world. And also, it's important to mention that this, quote, primitive art course, and, there were no quotes around primitive art in those days. It was just that was a thing, right? So, and this course took place not in the art museum. We had a wonderful art museum on campus. It didn't happen there. It took place in the ethnology museum on campus, which has a fantastic collection of Western and Central African masks and sculptures, which have been off view for almost, I'm going to have my 50th anniversary, 50th reunion next year. They went off view a couple of years after I left school, and they've been off view since, which isn't necessarily all wrong, because some of those things should never have been seen anyway on a regular basis. They were meant to be brought out selectively, sacred images. So to have those hidden and is not so bad. But the rest is just neglect, I think. So I took this course in desperation, and it turned out to be a life changer. I loved everything about the art I saw, plus the teacher, who was a graduate student, used our class time to show rough-cut films of masquerades that he had shot in West Africa in the previous, I think, 2 summers. After showing some footage, he would send us out into the galleries to track down examples of the types of masks we had just seen being danced. So this was wonderful. I was transported back to my elementary school chapel days and my MFA days that followed. I instantly understood that I was again, as I had been back then, in the presence of things that were alive, that moved, healed, played with gender, talked about politics, kept you in line, responded to your love. Again, art didn't just exist, it happened, and you were part of that happening if you approached it with an activist eye and with belief. Not necessarily a religious belief, but a faith in the power of religious belief or some belief that produced this art in the first place. I think, sorry, it's a sinus thing, it's not a cold, I think it was at this time that I fully connected some conceptual dots and understood that a lot of the European church art I had been looking at the MFA, and the Buddhist and Hindu art there that I'd spent so much time with, was alive in the same way. I would eventually see that many of the Western contemporary art forms I came to write about years later, conceptual art, performance art, process art, installation art, sound art, all existed without those labels in other cultures long before they became vanguard art here. So in more ways than one, that course was the beginning of my adult art education. The next year, 1967, purely by chance, my dorm roommate was a political science major studying Africa, specifically modern post-colonial African politics. He had just returned from Malawi. I learned from him things I didn't learn from the anthropology course about current political realities on the African continent. History was happening very fast in these years, the 60s. The late 60s were about transformational politics everywhere. In America, the liberations were underway. Civil rights, black power, the women's movement, and gay liberation. And the American war in Vietnam went on and on. In my last year of college, my roommate, who had by then become my partner, registered as a conscientious objector to the war and was required to do alternative service. My father got him a job in a community hospital in the nearby working-class factories town of Waltham. I took a job in the same hospital as an emergency room orderly. We worked there together for 3 years. Because the hospital was the only one in town, the emergency room really jumped. We got playground injuries and suicide attempts, dog bites and heart attacks, premature deliveries, and middle-of-the-night homicides. People came in dead and were brought back to life. People came in alive and died right there. We took patients up to the wards. We took bodies down to the morgue. For me, that job was the beginning of a different layer of education. It was an education in mortality, a hands-on lesson in first and last things. Basically, it was the same education that a contemporary of Emily Dickinson's, Walt Whitman, got when he brought candy and books to sick and dying soldiers in Civil War Army hospitals. This is what he wrote about in his book Specimen Days. His hospital experience had a lasting impact on him. Mine did on me. Among many other things, it clarified an affinity I already felt and that I still feel with art that is forthright in dealing in elemental ways with life and death. Medieval Christian art, Native American shaman art, tantric art, popular religious art from Latin America, African sculpture packed with spiritual medicines, and the contemporary art that would emerge from the AIDS epidemic, and I should say also the art that's in this show here on your campus. After that job, I spent a year in Europe, and I came to New York. New York in the mid-1970s was totally unlike the highline New York of today. The city was in terrible financial shape, was on the edge of ruin. The urban renewal, I put those in quotes, of the 1960s had trashed huge stretches of the outer boroughs, leaving working-class New Yorkers, many of them new immigrants, in poverty and danger. The mainstream press routinely referred to the South Bronx as a war zone, rarely mentioning that the war was a class war, an example of economic colonialism in action. What the press also failed to mention was that that, quote, war zone was producing some of the great American art and music of that day. Graffiti and hip-hop culture were blooming out of what looked like desolation, and only looked like desolation. I lived way downtown in Manhattan, below the World Trade Center. I lived with an artist, and I was surrounded by artists. The conversations were very interesting to me. So I started to write about art. I did mostly gallery reviews for magazines and cobbled together a freelance space. And I kept writing after I moved to the East Village in 1981. But then I gradually slowed down. The art market had entered a boom period, a prototype of what we're seeing today, although a real mini version of what we're seeing today, but still, for that time, it was quite something. Money brought problems. Artists were being pushed to produce too fast. Caution was replacing experimentation. The market did what it always does. It created a few stars, gave them everything, and gave everyone else nothing. I loved new art, but I felt I had hit a wall in writing about it. I needed a change. In the spring of 1983, I saw a show of Japanese Buddhist sculpture at Japan Society in Manhattan. And this is old Japanese Buddhist sculpture. I don't know how they ever got that. Well, because it was Japan Society. That's how they got the loans, because they were extraordinary loans. And the MFA, I knew about these things because of the MFA, which is one of the great collections of Japanese art in the world, certainly the greatest in this country. And so this is stuff I was tuned into. So I saw this show, and on the spot, the day I went to the exhibition, I decided I wanted to go to where the art came from. So I got a cheap flight to Japan, via Caracas or something. It just took forever to get there. And I stayed for about a month, mostly out in the countryside, going to monasteries, temples, and shrines. I just had a backpack. I didn't speak Japanese. Almost no one I met outside the city spoke English. So this was a very silent interlude, almost entirely about looking. Most of the art I saw, including some sublime antique sculptures, was being used in active worship in village temples. People treated images as if they were people, as if they were respected elders or coddled children. They left fresh fruit and glasses of water for them, and handwritten notes. I didn't know the religious meaning of any of these images, or very little about it, but I could see how much they were loved. The trip confirmed something I'd suspected about myself from past traveling, but had never formulated. The artist Louise Bourgeois once said that she didn't believe in God, but she had a religious temperament. I'm not religious in the sense of having a specific practice, but for some reason I have a pilgrim's temperament. I just like holy places. My definition of holy, like my definition of art, being very elastic. And it has often determined my travel choices. When I got back to New York, I wanted to write about Japan, but I just couldn't. I did not know how. At that point, all I knew was how much I didn't know, and that the Japanese art I'd seen, and the artists who made it, and the people who loved it, all deserved my best effort to learn. So I went back to school. This is 10 years after graduating from, roughly 10 years after graduating from college. At that point, I had a full-time job at City University of New York Computer Center. Don't know how that happened, but anyway. The job didn't pay much, but it came with free tuition. So I signed up for art history courses at CUNY, at a CUNY school, Hunter College, in Manhattan. It turned out to be a great choice. The teachers were smart, the classes were at night, and most of the students, like me, worked days. Grad school was a rich experience for me, completely different from most of college. It was the difference between doing something you want to do as opposed to doing something you're supposed to do. By the end of the first semester, I was totally committed, in for the long haul. I basically moved into museums and libraries and lived there. I felt like I'd taken vows. In the same way I looked at every kind of art in the MFA as a kid, I took every course Hunter offered. I even started out chronologically. Ancient Greek, then Roman, then medieval, and so on. I expanded my interest in Asia and made a huge personal discovery, the art of Islam. By that point, I'd been to Turkey and North Africa, so I knew that I loved Islamic material, but I loved it without knowledge. I had a wonderful teacher in Ukul Bates, who was Turkish, from Istanbul, and with whom I'm still in touch, regular touch, although she's retired now, many years. For her introductory lecture, she showed an hour and a half of projected images. These are the days of slides before PowerPoints. And she projected them one after another, with almost no commentary. Images of mosques in Iraq, Iran, Turkey, China, Africa, and Queens, New York. Plus ceramics, glassware, textiles, and handwritten Quran pages. It was like an aerial view of a global treasury, with everything linked by spiritual threads. She didn't say she'd made no distinctions between the value of any of these things. She just showed them. The final slide, Professor Bates's final Islamic treasure, was a snapshot of an elderly man and woman sitting side by side on a couch in an Istanbul apartment. "This is my mother and father," she said. So, home and the world, local and global, material and spiritual, knowledge and love, personal history and art history, absolutely inseparable. Every time I write about Islamic art for the New York Times, I think of my teacher and her parents. I thought of them a few years ago when I visited the great mosque at Janneh in Mali, West Africa, which is one of the images in that first lecture. When I was in small village mosques far out in the West African countryside, I thought of them. I think of them whenever I read news reports of United States bans on immigrants from Muslim countries. That Islamic course took me on a research trip to India, where I reconnected with Buddhist art firsthand. India took me to Columbia University to study early South Asian art. During this time, I had also started writing again for magazines, though often on non-mainstream topics. For that, I thank Betsy Baker at Art in America, who let me write about whatever I wanted to write about, including ancient Buddhist art and contemporary African American art, which wasn't covered very much at that time. She just said, go for it. So I did a lot of stuff I really liked doing. For me, art exists on one long continuum. And by that point in my life, old art and new art felt equally part of my life. I was trying to figure out a way of writing that would work for all of it. What I came up with was something like to write about art to write about the art of the past as if it were in the present, and to write about the present art as if it were a bit in the past. The best I can say is I'm still trying to learn to do this. It was while I was at Columbia that the Times called. They left a message on my answering machine and asked if I was interested in doing some work for them. At that point, I was starting work on my dissertation. I was trying to learn Sanskrit. I was teaching an introductory course on Indian and Islamic art, working at the computer center full-time, and writing for magazines. So I was totally out of my mind, so I said, sure. That was 1991. I think that the reason the Times actually had some interest in me was because that was a global moment in general, and there was a global moment for them. And because I went to that first interview with the editors, and I think to myself, I'm especially South Asian art. What can they, But they went for it, so it worked. The early 1990s were an extremely stimulating time to be covering new art in New York. When the economy bottomed out at the end of the 1980s and the market fell apart, some serious gate crashing happened. Walls came down. All kinds of new art came in. Not only did the art of African Americans, Asian Americans, Latin Americans, and Native Americans gain admittance, limited admittance, for sure, but it showed up for the first time, in my experience, in galleries and museums, even in museums. Also, new art from Africa, Asia, and South America showed up. Art that almost no one in the New York art world even knew existed. Multiculturalism has a lot of problems, as we all know, but for me, back then, and now still, it meant one main thing: everybody coming to the table, with all our colors, languages, genders, attitudes, and desires. At that table, we wouldn't just break bread, we'd cook up whole new cuisines, new kinds of nourishment, and everyone would get to tell their story, write their history. You probably had to have been around in the 1980s and 90s to fully understand how fresh and powerful the utopian spirit was at that time. And it really was. It wasn't just everybody felt quite hopeful, I think, or many of us did, that things were changing in dramatic ways that have proved not to have taken hold as deeply as we'd hoped. So far. The contemporary art market, even the contemporary art market, by nature conservative, controlling, and self-protective, felt for a very brief time capacious and generous. It certainly does not now. This was also a time when revolutionary things were happening in museums in terms of reconceiving ways to present art, and specifically non-Western art. For me, the most exciting experiments in New York were happening at a small institution called the Museum for African Art, founded in 1984 by the art historian Susan Vogel, who had been a curator in the Michael C. Rockefeller collection of primitive art at the Metropolitan Museum. The Museum for African Art began in a rented Upper East Side townhouse, then in 1992 moved down to Soho, where it had a basement level, Maya Lin space there. It was beautiful. Some of its shows were fairly straightforward collection loan shows. Others were like nothing anybody had ever seen, at least in this part of the world. Africa Explores in 1991 was one of the very first surveys of contemporary art from the African continent anywhere. And its formal and conceptual range, from academic painting to portrait photography to glass painting to Mercedes-Benz-shaped coffins to genius riffs on traditional forms, was completely mind-boggling. But the most radical show came 2 years later. It was called Face of the Gods: Art and Altars of Africa and the African Americas, organized by Bob Thompson from Yale. It was made up of 24 altars from various centers of Afro-Atlantic worship. Some were historical objects, borrowed from museums. A second kind consisted of untransportable ephemeral altars, like the sand altars to the goddess of the sea, built on the beach at Rio de Janeiro. In this case, they were constructed in the style of natural history dioramas by the museum design team. The third type of altars were brand new ones, also built for the show, but commissioned by the museum from priests and ritual practitioners from local diaspora communities in the Bronx, Queens, and New Jersey. These people agreed to make the altars in the museum, but only on the condition that they could also consecrate them, activate them, make them alive, and then ritually dismantle them when the show was over. The museum very nervously agreed to do this. Bob Thompson was not nervous at all, but the museum, Susan was nervous. A lot of people were. They used to see what happened. It was an experiment. Nobody had done this before. The effect was extraordinary. People who had never been to a museum before came because they'd heard about these live altars. Devotees of Cuban Santeria and Brazilian Candomblé came and left coins and fruit. People offered prayers and songs, left liquor bottles, did dances. For anyone who's been to a temple museum in India or Japan, the phenomenon was not unusual, but for a Western museum, it was virtually unheard of. It completely changed my already changing idea of what a museum could be and do. With that exhibition, for me, the art versus not art divide, also known as art versus ethnology divide, that defined the museums of my youth, evaporated. And along with it, hardwired aesthetic and ethical dictums about ethnicity, about art and sacredness, about the possibility of worship within a secular context. All that went for me, crumbled. All my doubts, and I had some. But the greatest revelation was to experience the museum space itself come alive, embrace life, and be embraced by life. In the years that followed, a few other exhibitions emulated this model. Among them, Sacred Arts of Haitian Vodou, organized by Donald Constantino and Marilyn Holberg for the Fowler Museum in LA in 1995, and A Saint in the City, Sufi Arts of Urban Senegal, organized by Alan Roberts and Polly Nutter Roberts, also for the Fowler, in 2003. In both cases, a new audience came, and museum business as usual, at least for a few months, was suspended. Saint in the City, I wish I had pictures, because this was so fabulous, this show. Saint in the City focused on visual images, most of them modern and contemporary, that were associated with Senegal's most influential Sufi movement, the Murid Way, which was founded by the poet, mystic, and saint Sheikh Amadou Bamba. The movement's primary image of Bamba was derived from the only surviving photograph of him that survived. It was taken in a French colonial prison at the turn of the 20th century. This image was endlessly produced, and if you went to Dakar, this is not, for interesting reasons, not true today, but if you went to Dakar even up to 10 years ago, 5 to 10 years ago, you'd see it everywhere. Shopkeepers had it in their stores. It was on the sides of buildings, and it's a single image of Bamba, his head with a white cloth wrapped around his face, and he's dressed in white, usually against a dark background. And it's the only image. It's repeated over and over and over again. And it's very important for devotees that they be able to touch this image. That's a very important thing. You have to put your hands on it and brush it, and get its energy that way. So, which doesn't work in a museum, of course. So Polly and Al had to talk to the security guards and say, look, people are going to come here and you're going to see them touching stuff, and it's okay. Just don't interfere. Let them do it. It's fine. So it became this very remarkable event in this show. And in fact, they said, the more people that touch these things, the better the more successful we think the show is. That's the way they took it. At present, though, interest in or fashion for doing such shows seems to be over. Maybe the attempt to accommodate live art makes too heavy a demands on institutions. Maybe Western museums just fundamentally don't believe in belief, or don't want to acknowledge it. I'm told, and I don't have verification for this, that the security guards at the cloisters, the Met's medieval branch, which is in Upper Manhattan, are instructed to intervene if visitors make gestures of worship or prostrate themselves or pray, or whatever, just kind of tell them to cool it, which wouldn't surprise me if it is true. And I find this unfortunate in light of the fact that the statistics say that museum audiences are getting less diverse rather than more diverse. So it seems to me that something should be done about that. A different approach should be taken. Part of my ongoing education as an art writer, and it really is ongoing, very weekly, is to rethink my own biases. When I first started writing for the Times, I still had one foot in academia, as I mentioned. I was still in that graduate program at Columbia. And I was kind of uptight a little bit about certain matters of aesthetic purity and validity, including what you could and could not admit as art. Luckily, I also had one foot outside the art world, outside that world, the academic world. And I was listening to some smart people in that outside part. One of those people was Susana LaValle, who was then director of El Museo del Barrio in Manhattan. And in the early 1990s, she and I were talking about a group of mid-career Latino artists in East Harlem whose work had consistently been passed over by the mainstream art world as being too spiritual, too political, too kitschy, which basically boiled down to meaning too Latino. I still hear people talk this way about art from Asia and Africa, contemporary art. So Susana said, quote, "To understand these artists, you have to know that their art isn't just about specific political causes. Many of these artists are grassroots cultural activists, teaching kids for free in the neighborhood, workshops, as if it were still the 1960s. Now they're no longer young. They're trying to support families, to fight for housing, to change things on their block, and still make their art. It's a different time, but they're living by the tenets they set earlier on. And that's something I have the highest admiration for. Their lives and art are of a piece." And she continued, "If you understand that view, you stop talking in terms of aesthetic right and wrong. I was once watching Pepin Osorio. Pepin Osorio is a New York-born, Puerto Rican descended artist who makes extraordinary large installations, mostly in Latino neighborhoods in Newark and New York City, in department stores, in schools, and he's really wonderful. I was once watching Pepin Osorio conduct one of his glittering installations. This one included a jeweled chandelier, and I kept referring to its fake pearls. Pepin said to me, "Susana, they're not fake pearls. They're not fake anything. They're plastic pearls. For many people, plastic pearls are what they have and what they want." I personally love the equivalent of Pepin's fake pearls. They are what I want, and they are what I have. People often ask me if I collect art, meaning art with a capital A. I do not. I never have. I'm very glad that art with a capital A is in museums, where I can see it, but I don't have to dust it, and I don't have to insure it. I do collect objects that I believe to be as beautiful and valuable as any that I know. Most of them are on a single shelf of a bookcase in my Bronx apartment. And I'd like to close here by mentioning, in no particular order, some of them, all but two of which I acquired myself. A metal prayer wheel from Kathmandu, purchased there almost 40 years ago. An aspirin bottle filled with Ganges water that I collected in Varanasi, India. a pocket-sized portrait of the 8th century Buddhist monk Kukai, also called Kobodaishi, that I bought at Koyasan, the Buddhist holy mountain, before I began a pilgrimage in Japan. A prayer card of the Virgin of Guadalupe from her shrine in Mexico City. A cross made of cactus wood, given to me by a homeless man after I bought a meal for him and his wife in Santa Fe, New Mexico. A postcard of the 13th century rock-cut Christian church of San Georgius at Lalibela in Ethiopia, East Africa, where there are a dozen of those rock-cut churches. A postcard portrait of Teresa of Avila from her convent in Avila, Spain. A small stone found on the floor of the great mosque at Djenné in Mali, West Africa. A dried thorn tree branch from Magao, the site of more than 400 Buddhist temples and monastic caves cut out of a cliff on the edge of the Gobi Desert in western China. A prayer card from the beautiful rural shrine on the Mohawk River in upstate New York, shrine of the Native American saint Kateri Katakawita, who was canonized in 2012. It's a piece of American folk art, that shrine. It's beautiful. A postcard of the miracle-working Black Virgin at Chart. A vial of sand, of colored sand from a Kalachakra mandala blessed by the Dalai Lama in 2011 when he visited Newark, New Jersey, which has in their Tibetan galleries, he's a fantastic, he's the best Tibetan collection in the country by far, and in those galleries it has a Tibetan altar which the Dalai Lama had consecrated many years ago and comes back periodically to reconsecrate. A statuette of Francis of Assisi, a gift from my late partner, Joe Roche. A seashell gathered from the Indian Ocean near the Hindu temple of Puri in East India. And a pebble from Emily Dickinson's garden in Amherst, Massachusetts, about 50 miles from here. This list is by no means exhaustive. The shelf is pretty crowded. I sometimes, but not always, think of it as an altar. I always believe all the objects on it are precious, and so they are. Thank you.
My name is Anne Dempsey. What advice would you give for those of us, I'm an art historian, teach at a public university, what advice would you give to art historians today as a lot of our medieval, ancient arts are being decimated? The classes, we can't teach these anymore. We no longer have faculty to do that. So on the one hand, how do we bring this into our other classes? What might we do to inspire students in the way that you were inspired?
Yeah. One thing, I was inspired because I actually went to where the objects were. So I think that's important, to get people in front of things. That's where it really all comes from. And so if you can get, that's what I feel, if you can get young people, any people, to go to the place where those things are and then talk about them with them looking at them, I think that's wonderful. That's probably the best, most persuasive way I can think of. Also, though, I'm sorry about this, my voice, but I think museums are doing themselves a disfavor, big museums, by installing their permanent collections without telling the truth about the objects in them, really. Or the Met, I've often thought this about. You've got such a range of things there, so many stories you could be telling, historical stories you could be telling. A lot of beautiful-looking things were made for really terrible reasons, and I think people who would be interested in knowing those stories. In the MoMA is trying to do this a little bit with its reinstallation of its permanent, which is a whole other thing, but of its permanent collection. They're trying to get other voices in there that have been shut out and actually say as much. We're now, many, many years later, trying to rewrite this. And I think our museums of older art should be doing much the same thing.
It's hard to get young students to actually go and look at these objects.
Yeah.
Like, why do I care about this?
Right. So bus them in, you know? I want to try, you know, get to the mat. I guess being there makes so much difference, I think. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks so much. It was delightful. I didn't know what to expect. I very much enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And I should say, your secret is safe with us. We won't tell anybody about the pebble from Emily Dickinson.
Oh, thank you.
Many things I like to ask. I very much appreciate the way you explore the resonance between the participatory quality in religious art and then in live art, the way you extend this to things that might be considered kitschy or even pop. But let me take it one more step, because what worries me is, and I don't know if it worries you or not, maybe you can help me to not be so worried about the phenomenon of seeing objects and events and encounters of popular arts that just seem, there's a celebratory quality, there's fun and even joy in it, but because it's corporatized, because there are other forces in play, it seems contrived, and I worry about it. In other words, there's something of what you're talking about there, but it's just so engineered, and there are ulterior motives in play. Do you mind if I'm going to...
Can you give me one example, maybe?
Just any range from pop music to many pop products. It's popular art in the culture today.
Right.
Which people are into, and there's something of this quality that I take you to be addressing, and yet it's so engineered and contrived, and so I worry about that. Or maybe I shouldn't.
If it's falsifying, if it's falsifying something, then I think it's worrisome. I'm trying to think of an example of this that that would apply to what I think you're saying, but I can't offhand. I wish. Yeah.
When he was describing this, I was thinking of, what is it, Fierce Girl? The one that stood against the bull on Wall Street, and how that was actually a manufactured...
Oh, yeah.
That it had corporate interest behind it.
Right. Well,
It
that's...
inspired a lot of people
Sure.
at the same time.
Sure.
Was authentic. And,
Yeah.
with the way you were describing what you were saying, that popped in my mind.
That makes sense, yeah. Well, I mean, it's good to write about those things and to give an accurate account of them. I think that's the best way to get the message out there. And it can be hard to do because the disguises can be quite clever, and but I think it's part of our responsibility as journalists to do that. I can't think of any other way to go about it, because corporate is so strong. It's very powerful. But that's what journalism is for, I think. Yeah. Yes.
I wanted to, I have a question, but I also wanted to, I guess thank you for sharing your story and your respect and admiration for the art. And I wanted to ask, as a student who has background in political science and Asian studies, having personal experience in looking at art as an artist and as someone who is also learning about Hinduism, Buddhism, and the different religions there are in the world. I have a question about how art should be viewed, because the way that I see art as something that is universal, but also something that's very political. Just because art, especially if you're making art as a poet or as an illustrator, your art has a message, and I was wondering, how do you think that art should be viewed when it's not viewed as a commodity, and when it's not used as a tool for teaching? Because unfortunately, a lot of the funding for art in schools are the first things that are cut because of this neoliberal, competitive, SAT, STEM, science agenda. So I was just wondering, how do you think, art should be viewed? I know that you said that art is something that is living and it's something that has a life within it. But I was wondering, how do you think that it should be taught, or how do you think it should be viewed within classrooms? Because not everyone has the same experience of having a world view
of different types of art and an appreciation of art at a young age. And I think that has to do with like empathy, or like, I don't like to use the word tolerance, but there's a lot of lack of tolerance for people who don't have exposure to different religions and cultures. So I was just wondering, that was like a really long question, but the question kind of aimed at how should art be viewed as political or a commodity? Yeah, you can like answer it however you want.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, as Ann Dempsey was saying, I think it does partly come down to education, which we're not getting, which we, in this country, we have we're making big mistakes in that direction. We're just not doing it. We're not educating. We're not putting art in the curriculum. And I think it should be in the curriculum. And art is, I mean, not art, yeah, but art is political. I think art always has a political valence of some kind. And I think that's worth making that clear to people, that it is part of your life. It is pertinent to you. And what people were thinking 500 years ago about their lives and what you are thinking now. The language is different, the look is different, but it's the same thing. And art has always expressed that over the years. So if you can go back and look at old art as if it were in the present, relates to your life, and then all the ethical categories that also apply to your life, all of that stuff is still pertinent to us. So I think that's the way to bring, to keep it alive, and to make it relevant to people, and to make it clear that this is about is a way to help you figure out your life, just like it helped people figure out their lives centuries ago. That's what it's about. You know, it's not a mysterious thing at all. It's really clear to me. It's one of the reasons I was so fascinated with older art, because it seemed to me, well, this makes total sense to me, and I'm in the 21st century. So yeah, I have great faith in teaching. You know, I just don't have great faith in everything that surrounds it, the government and so forth. Yeah, yeah.
I wanted to go back to thank you. We're all deeply, deeply thrilled and grateful. I wanted to go back to your reference to Bob Thompson,
Yeah.
And that Earth Shattering exhibition. He certainly was an expert. And what seems wonderful about the exhibition, as you explained, is that you had someone who had studied extremely hard to know African art, who then could talk about art of the past, or shall we say, bring that art of the past, but then opening it up to an intersection with the ephemeral, and then, as you said, the interactive nature in which individuals could actually bridge the exhibition space and the worship space. So do you think that that's possible? Those kinds of things can happen again? That authenticity, that you said, that love of the object that is validated, it's not a copy of something that's old, it's a real thing.
Yeah.
And to me, the way you were describing it is that validates the real thing of the ephemeral. It is ephemeral, but real. It's an experience. And it validates that momentary, you are all involved.
Right.
In terms of that. Have you seen, or can you think of any other instances that you could inspire us with about suggesting, how could that concept be propagated?
In the present, you mean? Yeah. Right. I'm trying to think of artists. I can't think of offhand of ones that necessarily are involved in religious practices or images. But I think of an artist like Tania Bruguera, who's a Cuban artist, who is a political artist primarily, but I think that this could also be extended to other areas. And Tania, about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, now moved to Queens, New York, from Cuba, and she rented a storefront, and she opened it up and to immigrants in the neighborhood. It's primarily an immigrant neighborhood, a lot of Colombian immigrants there, undocumented. And she lived in that house for a year. and received people. And what she provided was legal advice for immigrants, medical advice for immigrants, taught English language classes. I mean, she had a bunch of volunteers doing this. So she created this wonderful model for how you can put yourself in a community and do something for it, and continue to do something for it. The project still continues. It was originally supported by the Queen's Museum, then some other people kicked money in, the Queen's mayor, or whatever it is, kicked some money in, so it kept going. And so that's a kind of conceptual performance practice. The genres are fluid, and that I think is really, really valuable, and can continue to be. They're the ones I care most about, that I respond most to. I went out there a lot when she started that thing, sat in on classes and stuff like that. I just wanted to be there and see it happening. And it really was happening. It wasn't fake. I mean, it wasn't artificial. People came because they needed to come. They learned about it. Oh, this person will and go there. And they went, and they got the help they were after. And little kids came. It was wonderful. So the more of that, and it's art, but it's also something else. It's art in some other big way. So I love things like that. They make me very hopeful. This is the market, though, is really wreaking havoc on things. It just is, There's no question about it. And this is a newish phenomenon. It was not true in the 70s and the 80s, and even in the 90s it wasn't true. The 90s, because the market was so flat, everybody could have a say. And it opened up the way you could make art in this wonderful way, because you weren't going to make any money anyway, so just go for it, And people did. Now it's a whole, basically the whole city, New York City, is bought and paid for by corporations. So they own the loft you're living in, they own the gallery you're showing in or not showing in. It's all money. It's really hard. I don't know what people are going to do. But, yeah. Yeah.
I was extraordinarily drawn in by your personal narrative of changes in the art world and the role of things as they come alive for you. I was struck also by the fact that you started writing about art for publication substantially before you received your PhD. And this makes me think about the necessity or the role of the PhD and scholarly discourse in writing about art. It makes me think about what things can and cannot be said in scholarly discourse. So what would you say about the place and the role of traditional art historical scholarly discourse in the world today? Do we need traditional art history, or are other kinds of more receptive personal writing more important?
Well, I think we need both, and I think the two can be combined, probably. I was fortunate. When I started writing, there was a magazine called Arts Magazine in New York City that had been there since the 40s. And a guy named Richard Martin was the editor. There were exactly 3 staff members, and they were never in the office because they all had other jobs. And what you would do is you would write Richard a note. There was no email at that point, and say, Richard, I'd like to write about this and that, and so he would turn that note around right away and say, okay, go ahead. So I would go ahead and write these things, and then I couldn't email in those days, so I would go down to their office, which, as I said, was always empty. It was just this little tiny space on Madison Square Park. I would slip my manuscript under the door, and it would appear a month later. And he would send me a check for, I don't know what it was, like $25 or something, And it wasn't the amount of money that counted. It was the fact that he was treating you like a professional. It came exactly in the first of the month in the mail. You felt like an adult, like you were respected, and it was wonderful. He edited nothing. Nothing. Typos went in, everything got printed. It was, really, but it made you a good self-editor, which was important. You didn't want to get embarrassed again, so you started to edit yourself. But I think read any Lucy Lepard by any chance? Lucy's, yes, Lucy.
Lucy, we had come here and speak
Oh,
Rikers.
great.
Yeah, she was absolutely awesome.
She's wonderful, and she's an example of a scholar, a serious, deep scholar who has a wonderful, popular, conversational, approachable writing style. She's like she's talking to you, you know. She's one of the, but there are others who have this too. She's not the only one. So I do think these things can be combined. You know, I really do. And I think we need both. Absolutely. We need somebody to go live in those libraries and get that information. And then they put it into a catalog, which I hopefully, you know, and then I read the catalog and I pass it on to the New York Times, the information on to the New York Times and to you. And that's the route. But it's all necessary, I think. Yeah.
Questions,
Yeah, I was going to, did you have your hand up? Yeah.
if you have time. I'm in a course right now that's accompanying the Cancer Art Gallery, Dharma and Punya, and one of the first concepts that was introduced in this course was the idea that Buddhist imagery, there's dead and alive Buddhist imagery. So after a certain blessing, the deity is literally in the image. And when you were talking about your trip to Japan earlier, even though you had no knowledge of language or anything of that nature, you could tell by observation in these monasteries that certain objects were being treated with love, being treated with due respect, not as objects, but as individual entities. So I just wanted to see, it seems like there was a parallel there, and I would love it if you could elaborate on that a bit more, what you saw in the Japanese monasteries, and more specifically, how you saw objects being interacted.
Right. The first thing I saw when I landed in Japan, or one of the first things, was I went to the art museum, the big art museum in Tokyo and the big art museum in Kyoto. And in the big art museum in Kyoto, I was struck and shocked and amazed to see in front of a regular gallery full of Buddhist sculptures, high-end period Buddhist sculptures, in front of one of the sculptures was a little vase with a rose. I thought, well, that's just so wild, you know? How, it's a museum. You don't do that. But somebody did it. I don't know whether it was the museum who did it or somebody wandered in, but that was my first, struck me that something's different here. You know, this is a museum image, but it's something else is going on here. There's some kind of energy that I'm not used to in a museum. And then I would walk down the streets of Kyoto, and I'd see these little Jizo, Bodhisattva Jizo statues on shelves, and in front of that statue would be a glass of water, a full glass of water. So people are bringing Jizo a glass of water. So this was the kind of thing that before I even got out to the countryside and went to temples, this is the kind of stuff that I responded to, you know. And you go to Shinto shrines, and you know, wake up, you gods, pay attention to me, you know, that kind of thing. It was wonderful. So this is very unfamiliar, and that's what started it for me. And then you go out to the countryside and you see, people, you know, going to the temple and bringing things and all that. So it was very much a community visit. It was just very tender. You know, those are the things, the little things like that, gestures. Yeah. Yeah.
My question pertains to the art that's currently in museums. You said that a lot of information is omitted. I was wondering, do you think a lot of that information is falsified, or do you think they just omit certain information to draw the public in?
I think we omit it. I don't think it's, in some cases it's probably falsified, but I think it's mostly just admitted. We don't tell the full story. We just don't want to.
And you think that brings people in rather than, or do you think that stops people from coming rather than bringing them in, but they to bring people in that way?
I think people would be more interested if they felt that they were getting a complex story here of what really happened, what these images really signified. I think that would be a big help. I think I like stories. I just like stories. So I would like to have these narratives out there to see. And you can do it in a gallery. You don't have to just line things up in a row. You can put things in certain combinations that illuminate everything, you know. And the museums just haven't, in the permanent collection I'm talking about, they just don't do it, or very few of them do. But yeah, I think we need to know more history. We just need to. Yes.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on art restoration, specifically cultures restoring things from outside their own culture, so like Western artists trying to restore like Japanese works, for example, because it comes from a place of good intentions and trying to fill out the whole story, but a lot of times gets things wrong. So I was curious if you had any opinions on that.
Yeah, I think it's probably a case-by-case thing, really. I don't think there's any bottom line comment to be made about it, but I think some things, as you say, can be falsified rather badly, yeah. But on the other hand, there's a whole tradition of conservation within a culture, something the culture itself touches up things, and that's acceptable to do that. You freshen up the paint a little bit. So, as I say, it depends on the circumstances and who's doing it and what the motives are, I think. Yeah.
I'll take one more.
One more, if there's anybody else? Yes, sir.
Yeah. Talking about your fantastic, wonderful pieces that you buy at the New York Times, how is the process for you internally? Of course, I can understand that there will be a lot of people you have to coordinate at the newspaper, but how is your internal process to select the gallery show that you want to highlight or to write about? Because there are a lot of galleries in New York City.
For sure, yeah. So how do we make those decisions about what to cover?
Yeah, especially you.
Well, they're personal in many ways, because I write about, we put together lists at the beginning of every semester of stuff that's coming up, and then we go through the lists and we choose this and that. The other thing, we may do trade-offs on things. It's almost arbitrary, I'm afraid to say, There's no science to it at all. Yeah, I mean, believe me, I walk around laden with guilt about stuff I haven't gone to see or I haven't written about. I'm serious, So, yeah, I can't. So I'm afraid there's no good answer for that. I'm sorry. I can't give you any reassuring answer.
Maybe you are walking around the city and you enter in a gallery and you really like it, but maybe it's not possible then to write about every gallery.
It's true, yeah. And you do, and one thing I've done in the past is I look around and I see what hasn't been covered in a long time. And my interests are maybe different from my colleagues' interests. So I will go to some place and cover a show just because that place has been ignored. And that intrigues me, So I go ahead and look and can write about it for that reason. But it's arbitrary. There's no justice.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, yeah, sure.